Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. I'm Simon from Five Leaves, and I just want to do a quick little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. Feel free to use the chat function throughout, talk amongst yourselves, and I'll be watching it as well. But if you do have any questions for Jackie and Keith, please put them in the Q&A function along the bottom so that Michael can find them towards the end of the event. The event will be up on YouTube in a few days, and you can see all of our previous events there too. And I'll be posting a link to buy the book during the chat and keeping an eye on the chat throughout. So I'll hand over to Michael, our host for the night. He's a writer based in Nottingham with a big interest in London and Bob Dylan. And I'll hand over to you guys. Thanks.
Happy 80th birthday, Bob Dylan from Nottingham Town. The tune of which, of course, he purloined for Masters of War. And we're here tonight to talk to Jackie Lees and Keith Miles, the writers of this lovely, lovely book, Bob Dylan in London, Troubadour Tales. When I first read it, when it first came out, I must admit I was as nostalgic about London as I was about Dylan, because I haven't been there for over a year now, and I look forward to when we can go again to walk the the maps that are in the book. You deal in the book with all the times that Bob spent in London, and particularly we'll start off with his very first trip in 1962, because that was before he was known at all in this country, and it was extremely influential on him. And you've done some great detective work about the places where he played. So I wonder if you could spend a little time on December 1962, please.
Yes, well, good evening, everybody, and happy birthday, Bob. Obviously, we were fascinated by the times. Jackie and I had done our own pilgrimage around the pubs and clubs and places he'd stayed, and it fascinated us, particularly that December 1962 to January 1963 period, when the BBC brought him over for a TV play, Madhouse and Castle Street. It fascinated us that it wasn't really covered in the books. Huge numbers of books about Bob Dylan and well-known tomes like Robert Shelton's No Direction Home, which not only had very little about that time, which was a pivotal, integral time to Dylan's career, but not only was there not very much in those books about it, but a lot of it was wrong. We wanted to not only recognize the places that were important to Dylan's career, but particularly that early time, we wanted to put the record straight a little. As Dylan fans and Londoners, Robert Shelton, for example, in No Direction Home, which is one of the most well-known biographies about Dylan, and here's someone who actually came to live in England. He had Dylan down at playing at very different pubs. He had him down at the Prospect of Whitby, which is not a folk scene pub. And we wanted to go around and see if we could find out and do a little bit of music archaeology to find where he played and when he played. And there were a number of candidates for the first place that he played outside of North America. There were three candidates. There was the King and Queen, there was the Troubadour, where Jackie and I had a particular link to, and there was the Singers Club, which we, through various ways, identified as being a pub called the Pinder of Wakefield. And of the three candidates, two of those had plaques up saying that Bob Dylan played here first, and it was a third that hadn't got a plaque up, which is the actual one that he played first. And that was in December 62. And as you say, he was very young. He was not known outside really Greenwich Village. He was known on the folk scene, and a very wonderful folk singer over here called Martin Carthy recognised him at that first King and Queen gig. Martin was playing with the Thameside Four, recognised Bob Dylan from a magazine cover and asked him if he would play. and he did, and that was the start really of Dylan's love affair with London.
And that's how you can be certain that it was the King and Queen, is it? Because of Martin Carthy's memories. Yes,
he's a very good we were talking to him last night. No, so we did a wonderful Q&A book thing at the Wanted Tap yesterday, and Martin Carthy rang in and we had him live with the audience. He was 80 this last week as well, and happy birthday to Martin Carthy. You know, he was a great friend to Dylan through that time, and he was a very good, credible eyewitness. You know, he really was reliable on that sort of side. And Dylan stayed with him for a while. He then followed Dylan around. He played with them at the Troubadour. He went to all the other clubs. And frankly, and there is photographic evidence of Dylan playing at that night at the King and Queen. And frankly, if Martin Carthy, who was with him on the other times, says that was where he first saw him, that's most likely to be the first place. So that's what we base it on: eyewitness and photographic evidence.
Can we say a little about why he was in London? And I particularly ask this because Philip Saville directed a film that I wrote, so I knew Philip quite well, and he was the reason that he came over. Can you say a little bit about why that was?
Yes, so Philip Saville had spotted Dylan. He'd been on a trip himself to America, and he'd spotted Dylan playing in a little bar called Pastor's Place, and obviously clocked this young folk singer, kind of a scruffy guy, but must have had something so incredible even back in 62. And then when he was casting the play Madhouse on Castle Street, it required an anarchic young student, I think was the part. And his mind went to this guy that he'd seen in Greenwich Village just a few months earlier. And I just constantly think, wow, he must have made such a huge impression, because he invited him over, got the BBC to stump up quite a big fee, really, put him up at the Mayfair Hotel, which is even back then presumably cost an arm and a leg. And shock horror, at the first reading of the play, they're sitting round the table, and Dylan himself basically said, I can't read this, I can't do this, It didn't stop him trying to be an actor in the future. He didn't seem to learn the lesson.
It should have done, maybe. It should have done.
Exactly. He's not exactly set the world on fire through his...
He's a genius in many respects.
But not that one.
But not that one. Level, I would say not.
Yeah. So what they had to do was they had to split the part into two. They hired a professional actor called David Warner to play the speaking role. And Bob Dylan played 4 songs for that fee. And as has been pointed out, there was the strike at one point at the BBC. Nothing much changes. And the whole filming had to be redone at a certain point, and Albert Grossman, Bob Dylan's manager, managed to renegotiate him the fee, so he got paid twice over basically for not being able to act and for singing 4 songs. And then of course the tragedy of the whole thing is that this play was broadcast in 1963, and it was then consigned to the flames later on, as Keith has often said, not when Bob Dylan was still unknown, but when Bob Dylan was a huge star in about 1968. The BBC, in its wisdom, decided to get rid of the tapes. And so Arena later, the show on BBC Two, Arena, put out this call: has anybody got the play, or has anyone got the music? And a few people had very enterprisingly stuck microphones in front of their TV screens. So they've managed to piece together those 4 songs, and they are still, you can still hear them if you hunt through YouTube. They made a brilliant documentary called Dylan in the Madhouse, which appears now and again in independent cinemas. I would love it if they would release that so we could all have a copy, but every so often it pops up. It's well worth seeing.
And one of the things we've found out since publishing the book, and we of course because the film is destroyed, we can't verify this, but I've been told on reasonable good grounds that there was a school child in the play that appears, and it was Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd. So, but we will never know. We will never know.
That's another urban myth, Keith. Or
That's a beautiful urban myth. I so want it to be true.
Can we talk a little about the influence of the songs he heard on Dylan's own songs and his own writing, and the stuff that he saw with Martin Carthy and others while he was over here at that time?
Yes, absolutely. So he's often been described as a sponge, a musical sponge, and he went round a lot of the folk clubs in London. He didn't necessarily get up and perform in all of them, but he certainly made the attempt to get round a lot. And he was then hearing folk songs in the English, Scottish, the tradition of the British Isles that he would have heard in their kind of maybe Appalachian versions back in the States. And an obvious example of a song that he took and made his own was Scarborough Fair, which Martin Carthy had a particular arrangement of that Dylan loved and would ask Martin Carthy to play him. And at one point in that first trip, 62-3, Dylan popped over to Italy. I think he was seeing Odetta, another of Albert Grossman's stable of artists. And when he came back to the Troubadour, or to their house or whatever it was, he saw Martin Carthy and he said, "Hey Martin, here's Scarborough Fair." And he played Girl from the North Country. So it's just replacing the word Scarborough Fair in the North Country Fair, and of course making it extremely beautiful. And it's not just a copy; he's made it his own. He took other of the songs he heard, particularly from Martin Carthy. But as Keith said, we spoke to Martin Carthy last night, and he was very keen to point out it wasn't just him. I think he was being modest. It obviously wasn't just him, but Martin Carthy really befriended Dylan and spent a lot of time with him. But yes, he soaked up these English, Scottish, Irish folk tunes. He'd heard a lot of Irish folk songs in New York from the Clancy brothers, and had already taken some of those. Dylan is, it's that line, isn't it, between, well, love and theft, I was going to say, to coin a phrase, but actually he takes a song and he turns it into something that he can really call his own. And people are always saying, "Oh, but he steals, he appropriates." But I mean, people will argue about this till kingdom come, no doubt. But if anybody else could do it, I'm pretty sure they would have. And Dylan has done what he has done to such spectacular success over the years. And I think, there's fancy words for it. What is that word?
Intertextuality.
Oh my goodness.
But I think what Dylan was doing, and I think Martin Carthy was being very kind. The folk scene in London at that time was quite a strict one. They had rules about what you could do and what you couldn't do and what instruments you could use and that sort of thing. And although Martin Carthy was a great friend, there was a wee bit of hostility. Dylan was a pretty brash American coming in, and Martin Carthy, to his credit, befriended him and supported him. But also, as he said, he would listen to the folk songs there. Look, Bob Dylan would take something like Lord Randall, which is an old folk song, and craft that into a Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall. And there is, it's chalk and cheese. They're wonderful old folk songs, but Dylan's putting them into some of the finest popular songs that have ever been written and performed. There's a huge difference. And Martin Carthy realized that, steal away, if you're going to do that sort of thing, it's wonderful.
That's the folk tradition. I'm glad you mentioned Lord Randall, because that is a fantastic transformation of that song into one of Dylan's, at such a young age to write a lyric like
absolutely.
I suppose the other one you could mention from Martin Carthy's repertoire was Lady Franklin's Lament,
That's right.
Came,
That's
Bob
right.
Dylan's
Bob
Dream.
Dylan's Dream.
Yeah,
That's right.
Dylan's
Because
Dream.
he'd already written A Hard Rain. He didn't take that
No,
from
no.
what he heard in the UK. He'd
No.
already heard that. So there's this cross-fertilization really between America and Britain at that time. It was extremely important that Dylan came to London at that point. And then, as we know, Michael and will no doubt talk about, he came back on quite a few occasions through the 60s. But Martin Carthy says that it's one of the reasons that Keith and I wrote the book, really, is Martin Carthy said what had never been properly said was the influence of Britain, of London, of England on Dylan. And Martin Carthy says he heard England all over Dylan's next few albums.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm not a musicologist in that way, so I'd have to take it as being something that someone very skilled in that tradition would be able to hear straight away. But obviously Martin Carthy is that person. May I just interrupt for 1 second? A picture flashed up on my screen of some boats. We were going to try and show you a picture of the King and Queen pub, which is where Martin Carthy asked Dylan if he wanted to come out the audience. So Simon from Five Leaves has some slides, which hopefully he may be able to, at a certain point, get up on the screen just to show people. Aha, there it is.
There it is.
So that's the beautiful King and Queen. That's in Fitzrovia, just north of Goodge Street, sort of only a stone's throw really from Oxford Street. And the little insert there is a picture that you can see on the wall, taken by a photographer called Brian Shewell, I think it was. Yeah.
Yes.
And that is the sort of photographic evidence of Dylan on the upstairs stage in the King and Queen, which still has a club there, still has music, tiny little upstairs room. But it's a lovely pub.
And that's what we did with the photographic evidence, is because, although Dylan wasn't known over here, he wasn't a star, he hadn't had any major records, his first album had sold in the hundreds. But within the folk club scene, such as Martin Carthy, he was recognised as known. He was, this new wonder kid from Greenwich Village. So when he went into clubs and he played, he was photographed. There are 2 photographs of that particular scene, playing at the King and Queen. When he gets to the Troubadour at times, there are 5 photographs of him playing there at different points. And it's and also with the Singers Club, which was the next day. That's the boys having a party in January when he came back. Martin Carthy is the serious chap looking down, actually playing music while the others are partying, really. So we were told last night there was a fair bit of recreational marijuana going on. Was that the term Martin used?
It was. It was. You can see they're having a really good time.
And in fact, one of the people in those days of the folk scene who used to frequent the Troubadour Club was a nurse from the Brompton Hospital up the road, who used to occasionally purloin different drugs of different shades. And that nurse was Sandy Denny, who became a folk singer with Fairport Convention.
Well, I want us to move on to 1965, but there's been a question come in which is actually appropriate to what you just said, from Michael Stock. Is there not an album with Farina von Schmidt and Dylan recorded in England in 1962?
There is. There was
a grunt one, isn't it? I believe.
Yeah, there is one that was recorded. It was Richard Farina was here to write a novel, which he did. Eric von Schmidt. These are 2 friends that are in that picture at the Troubadour that Dylan partied with a lot during that time. Eric von Schmidt was here to record an album, which is a short album. We went past it the other day on one of the walking tours. There was a record shop that Doug Doble, who was a jazz fiend, but realised there was money in folk music. And he opened a couple of record shops, and in the basement of one, and this was Dylan's first basement recording, was at Doble's on Charing Cross Road. And in that basement, they recorded an album. It was only 19 minutes. For tax purposes, Doug Doble, who hated the album, if you produced 100 albums, you had a certain purchase tax. So he produced 99 of these to sell. It did so bad, it took him a year to sell the 99 albums. And the boys did it. Dylan was introduced in that basement to Guinness, which he hated, but also Gordon's Gin, which he loved. And on the back of the album, Gordon's Gin is credited with an acknowledgement. So,
of course, and in that album, and he recorded as Blind Boy Grunt.
He did,
on
Blind
that
Boy
album?
Grunt.
Yeah,
because he was contractually obliged to Columbia, so he kind of wasn't supposed to be on it, but he was doing it for his mates.
I'd like to move you on because we've got a lot to get through, and I want to talk about 1965 and in the Savoy, which people will be quite familiar with through Don't Look Back, the D.A. Pennebaker film. Can you specifically talk a little bit about the filming of the Subterranean Homesick Blues beginning of that film?
Yes, that wasn't intended to open the film originally. So originally it was going to be opened with the film, with Dylan. D.A. Pennebaker had come over to film the concert tour, the 1965 concert tour of the UK. And one of Dylan's songs that he was performing in that tour, it was purely acoustic at that point, is a song called She Belongs to Me. And it's got the line, she's an artist, she don't look back. So he was going to open the film with a clip of Dylan singing this song with that line in it. But at that point, although Dylan was getting very well known, Pennebaker made a kind of a decision that not enough people would be able to really understand what this film was about with this lone singer singing this song that they might not have heard and might not be familiar with. So when they then recorded Subterranean Homesick Blues in the alleyway down the back of the Savoy Hotel, it's so powerful, so impactful visually and sonically, that it was decided that would be the opening to the film, as it indeed opens the album, bringing it all back home.
I must admit, Jackie, that when I first saw it many, many years ago, I assumed it was in New York, and I talked to a friend in New York this weekend, and he was equally surprised to hear that it had been shot at the back of the Savoy Hotel.
So was I, Michael. Yeah. So was I.
It's amazing. It's 2021, and people still think that's in New York.
And it's really, it has that look, doesn't it? I mean, but it's so incredible because in one way it's so quintessentially London and English. It's on the right-hand side where Dylan is standing. It's the Queen's Chapel of the Savoy, you know, an actual church owned by the monarch, in which when you go to a Sunday service, as I did as part of the research, they start with the national anthem. And another lovely little fact is that Martin Carthy was a choir boy there. Because you know, they're obviously Carthy and Dylan's, as we've already said, their lives intertwined quite a lot. So yes, it was a very packed time that Dylan was over with the film crew. And the film Don't Look Back got criticised quite a lot for not favouring the concert footage enough. You know, there's all this wonderful concert material, and you only get relatively small snippets of the music through the film, because I suppose that the action that was going on in the suite at the Savoy Hotel was so compelling in a way to just, you know, they call it a fly on the wall documentary. I cannot believe that there's even a minute in there where Dylan is not aware of the cameras and that he's being filmed. He's far too canny, far too, you know, sort of aware of everything. But it means that we get to see this wonderful period in the 60s, all these musicians dropping in to see Dylan, including Manfred Mann, Alan Price, Marianne Faithfull, and very typically, and I think again, Simon from Five Leaves, we have a photograph there of Dylan at the Savoy Hotel with one of his frequent guests, which was Donovan, a folk singer and Donovan and Dylan. So you've got Donovan there in the middle with the guitar. And that photo makes it look like Dylan has turned his back on Donovan, which is obviously not at all the case. Dylan is just chatting to somebody else. Music would just be happening. Donovan would pick up the guitar, and that was just how it was. But again, the film Don't Look Back was also rather craftily edited, I think, to really try and heighten this sense of rivalry between Dylan and Donovan. Dylan said he liked Donovan, he really appreciated his music, he liked his music, but there's a sing-off almost within Don't Look Back, where Donovan picks up the guitar and plays one of his songs, which is, I think it was To Sing For You, if that's the right title, if I've got that right. And then Dylan sort of went, my turn, and just kind of knocks it out the park, really, by playing It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. And the camera pans to Donovan's face, and we're all meant to think that Donovan is just thinking, well, I might as well go home now. But I really think that was just the editing. And another small thing about the Donovan situation is that the first song that Donovan played for Dylan was called Darling, My Darling Tangerine Eyes, which he had heard Dylan singing in 1964, 1 year before, at the Royal Festival Hall, where he debuted Mr. Tambourine Man. And he had obviously gone home, he'd had this song, these lyrics in his head, he'd composed his own song, and then perhaps he had just forgotten that when he then came to the Savoy and played it, Dylan remarked something like, well, I've been accused of not writing all of my tunes, but I think I did write that one. But that wasn't shown in the film. And I think that Dylan would have exerted some sort of control, and he would have known that would be embarrassing. And it's not in the film, but it's mentioned in Marianne Faithfull's autobiography and in D.A. Pennebaker's autobiographies. So, but yeah, it's such a wonderful film. Even now, after all these years, it's so watchable.
Well, Donovan, of course, also wrote some of the captions for the Subterranean Homesick with Joe Byers, I believe. But there was a comment from a friend of mine, Mark Cosgrove, saying that the fact that Allen Ginsberg and Michael McClure were also in there given an NYC. I have to tell Mark it's not Michael McClure, it's Bobby Newworth, isn't it?
It's Bobby Newworth, indeed.
There are lots of pictures with Michael McClure and Dylan, but certainly Ginsberg, who'd been thrown out of Prague and come over, and was a good foil in the film, really, to be perfectly honest. But you always associate him with New York. He's so New York, really, isn't he?
Yeah, but also, I mean, well, it's not a part of your, but also in Ronaldo and Clara, Allen Ginsberg plays a big part. But
yes,
I'm sorry to rush us here, but there's so much I want to get through, because a year later, 1966, that is the infamous tour, isn't it? That's where this picture in Nottingham was taken. But right. It's also the time of the Royal Albert Hall.
It is. So we have a slide of the Royal Albert Hall itself. Maybe that can just be put up. Probably, I'm sure everybody is very familiar with what the Royal Albert Hall looks like. So in 65, when he was staying at the Savoy, that is where that concert tour culminated, with 2 dates at the Royal Albert Hall, and the following year in 66. And you could not have had 2 more different audience experiences, really, than between those 2 years. So in the first one, the 65 tour, Simon, we have a picture that's called, I think, Folk Singer 1965. That's the one, Folk Star, that's right. And that's the cover of the book of Bob Dylan in London, really. Our artist, Julia Vitronjek, who did the beautiful artwork for us. I think she took inspiration from the soul figure of Dylan in the spotlight there. And then, as you say, Michael, he was back the following year. What I'd just like to point out that in 65, there are little clips of him saying the audience response was becoming predictable. he knew what people were going to do. He knew exactly how they were going to react. And it's fairly obvious he was getting bored. He didn't want to just keep churning out the same old. He could have just gone on doing that. He could still be doing it, but he himself, as a creative force, had now got new ideas in mind. And in a way, the folk music crowd had claimed him as their own, and there was this betrayal. So we have the next slide of 66, where he turned into a rock star. But Dylan's first influences were not Woody Guthrie and folk musicians. They were Little Richard and Buddy Holly and Elvis Presley. So this was always there in his DNA, if you like, in his blood. And he must have been a bit lonely, I think, all those years of being a solo folk star.
I think he always wanted to be in a band. I mean, in his high school yearbook, his ambition was to be in Little Richard's band. And he told friends that he used to make up a lot of things, bless him, in the early days. He told friends he was the pianist for Bobby V, and stuff like that. The folk thing came along and was a kind of a stepping stone for him. He followed that path, but he always wanted to be a rock and roller in a way, and he always wanted to have a band. And the Hawks coming along were absolutely wonderful. And as we know from the performances, they were the ideal band for him at the time, frankly. So he was very lucky with them.
And he did still try to please everyone, because even those concerts at the Royal Albert, not just the Royal Albert Hall, but through that entire UK tour, which included the infamous Manchester Free Trade Hall concert with the taunt of Judas being shouted at him by somebody in the audience, who was later tracked down, and there was a whole effort made to find that person. But the first set was again Dylan playing an acoustic set, and I've read a lot about this whole period, and some of the audience, bless them, kept hoping all the way through, perhaps he's not going to bring the band on, perhaps he'll change his mind. And then interval, they come back, the band's on, and they just let rip, just launch into, and of course, we weren't there, obviously. I have spoken to one or two people who were, and there are people who will say it wasn't really just that he went electric. It was that the volume and the quality was so awful that we just, couldn't really hear it. But there were also organized protests. The Communist Party of Great Britain, I think, was responsible, because folk music was meant to be about the proletariat, about the common people. But Dylan had already long gone away from that. He was writing folk songs, yes, still, but they were about individuals. They were not about the folk as a whole. It was not We Shall Overcome. It might be the Ballad of Hollis Brown or Emmett Till or, Medgar Evans. This is not the folk tradition. The folk tradition is not individualist. So really by 1966, the writing was already on the wall. But we've all been there. We probably all, I think Heath said something last night about when Dylan in 81 came back. We'll get on to Earls Court, but when he came back and he had his Christian era, a lot of Dylan fans at that point were like, what are you doing? You've betrayed us.
I was one of them. But
so I can understand.
I wasn't talking about betrayal. I was just talk about mixed up confusion,
I think we were bemused at what we were hearing and seeing. And I mean, I think that back in 66, people should have seen the signs. I mean, he was playing electric music. You could hear that on the albums. That was already coming through. And also when they arrived at the Royal Albert Hall, there were these huge amplifiers. They knew something was going to happen in the second half. And I think to a large extent, Albert Grossman, who was a canny manager, played it for shock value. You had an acoustic set and it was wonderful. And then Dylan went off, and they didn't they didn't meld things in. They went straight into, what I would like to term the first punk song, Tell Me Mama. and it's straight in, crash bash loud. And as Jackie said, it wasn't great acoustics. They were using a borrowed rig, and it was not great sound. But they wanted that. Grossman knew that these were headlines. This was money coming through if there were those sorts of headlines, and that was the case, really.
Did that happen in the States as well?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. No. It was exactly.
Oh yes. Yeah.
It was
And
same
that's what led to this, burnout. Really, the Hawks, the drummer Levon Helm, he wouldn't come. He wouldn't come to the UK. He was like, well, we've been shouted at all the way through America. Well, what do we want more of this for in Europe? But the others did. And I remember Robbie Robertson said somewhere, Robbie Robertson from the Hawks, later the band and a solo performer, said they were confused. They knew that the music was good. They knew what they were playing was good. And they were recording these concerts, and wonderfully, we can actually relive those. We can hear many of those tracks from some of that tour. But he said, we had to listen after the concerts and were we crazy? Were we that bad? But it was,
There's a good film you can find somewhere by Mickey Jones, who was the replacement.
The drummer, that's right.
It took a lot of 8mm movies, which were. But anyway, can we elide 78 and 81 then the two Earls Court visits and talk about them as you've already mentioned the 81 tour, but can I just ask one question before we move on to there? When he comes back to England in 65, 66, and now, so presumably he doesn't have the chance to spend actually much time in London as London like he did when he was young. He was confined to quarters, and he didn't. Did he do much sightseeing?
Well, we've got a few tales. There's a lovely tale of him wandering London Zoo. On his own as a tourist. These are great little stories that we picked up along the way for the book. But yes, he does to a certain extent, but he can't wander around and party and sleep on sofas like he did in 1962, certainly. But when he finished in 66, he then had the motorbike crash and he really retreated from everything. But eventually when he came out in America and he was doing the Rolling Thunder and all these sorts of things, they passed us by. So for mainland England, it was a gap from 66 to 78 of 12 years. And I'm one of the eyewitnesses in this part of the book, because in 1978, having loved Dylan through my sort of childhood and teens, 1978 was really the first time for us non-60s fans to see Bob Dylan. And 1978, it was absolute Dylan mania, even though it was post-punk and, you'd have thought Dylan wouldn't have been that cool, but seriously, I slept on the streets of Hammersmith with my sister to get tickets, and there were people up and down the country, desperately trying to get tickets for this. And we cover that in the book, but we also cover what was a fascinating spin-off of that, is that they realized after 6 nights at Earls Court selling out that actually Bob Dylan was really very popular still, and they could sell a lot of tickets. So in those days, there was nowhere else to play. Earls Court in the 70s was the big stadium. And it wasn't a great stadium for acoustics, but that's what you had. And they eventually decided, we're going to find somewhere to put on another gig. And the only place they could find was a disused aerodrome outside of Camberley in Surrey, which was Blackbush. And here we go. Earls Court and Blackbush. That's Blackbush there on the right hand side, and the top hat he's wearing there was borrowed from the doorman at the Dorchester Hotel, and just to give him a bit of height on stage, really. But the picnic at Blackbush, which is what it was known as, was 200,000 people assembling in a field, basically, with a stage. There were very, very little facilities that we would know from a modern festival, and 200,000 people had a heck of a time. There are tales of people losing their virginity there. It was all going on. There were stars galore, and there were 200,000 people who couldn't get home that night. So it was a wonderful, wonderful, crazy experience. And we like to think, that it kind of kick-started the modern festival, because Glastonbury and the hippie side had been long gone, and it was basically the kickstart to that time. And then, as you say, Dylan came back in 81, and I was one of those people, like your good self, who was a little bit bemused by the Christian era music. Didn't really get into it early, I have to say. Watched him in 81 and was disappointed. But if you go back now to the Trouble No More and the official bootlegs of that time, this was Dylan at his absolute finest in performance. Wonderful singers, fabulous musicians, and actually Bob Dylan, without the pressure on him, because some of those gigs didn't sell out at all. So they had to cancel gigs on those tours of the Christian era. And he didn't feel he had that pressure on. And you can hear someone really enjoying their music on stage.
Someone's asked us about the Isle of Wight festival, which is why I think Keith said specifically he hadn't returned to mainland England.
Yes, I said mainland. I wasn't quite counting the Isle of Wight, even though as a small child I was on the Isle of Wight at the time.
Yeah. So that was 69, Keith?
69, but I was too young to remember anything, so unfortunately it doesn't count.
That's wonderful that he came to the Isle of Wight, because basically Woodstock, where he lived, was just about to happen. Instead of performing at Woodstock, which is what everyone expected, he decided to pop over to the Isle of Wight instead and performed here, which I think is always a lovely story. Now,
sadly, unfortunately, folks, I am going to have to exit stage left.
Can't you wait for the time for me to put my hat on?
Oh, I've got to wait for that. I've got to see that, Michael. That's superb.
The Camden Town story, which is my favourite.
I shall leave Jackie, unfortunately, with the Camden Town story and to take you round. Wish everyone a happy Bob birthday. Do enjoy the book. Do enjoy the book, everybody. It's very much a labour of love from me and Jackie. So I have to leave early, unfortunately. But thank you very much, Michael. And I will leave you in Jackie's capable hands. Okay.
Bye.
Cheers, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Right. So, 1993, Camden Town.
Yes.
One of the best stories in the whole of the Dylan mythology. So please, would you give us that?
Sure. You're talking about Crouch End specifically.
I most certainly.
Yes, so in 1993, Dylan was writing or performing an album called World Gone Wrong, an acoustic album of traditional folk tunes. It was following another one which was called Good As I've Been to You. So he was going back to his more sort of folk roots. And he was over to work with the producer, Dave Stewart, who used to be in the Eurythmics, but who had a studio in Crouch End. And the story, which was basically, it was verified by the woman who she phoned into the Danny Baker radio show to tell this story, which was that one day she was at home and there was a knock at the door, and she opened the door and there was Bob Dylan. And Dylan said, oh, hello, is Dave in? Assuming that he was at Dave Stewart's house. And by chance, the woman's husband was called Dave, but not obviously Dave Stewart. It was Dave the plumber. So she said, no, I'm sorry, he's out at work, but would you like to come in and wait for him? So Bob Dylan went into the house and sat down and presumably had a cup of tea or whatever. It's made into a beautiful little film on the Sky Art series called Knocking on Dave's Door, where they really dramatize it and make it all. There's Eddie Marsan, who plays such a convincing Bob Dylan that the first time I saw it, I honestly did think, my God, they got Bob Dylan. Just for about a second, I was completely fooled. So the woman then goes to the phone and rings her husband and says, Dave, did you invite Bob Dylan round? And he didn't, of course. And the reason for the mix-up is extremely believable, which is that anyone who knows Crouch End will know that there are some roads that sound rather the same: Crouch Hill and Crouch End Hill. And the number that Bob Dylan had was for one or the other of them, and the number didn't exist on that particular road, either Crouch Hill or Crouch End Hill. So he went to the nearest one, which was Dave the plumber's house. And it's a very endearing story. It is in Sky Art's Urban Myth series, so we cannot be 100% sure that it really happened. But I think, as we say in the book, we like to think it happened. But he also, in Camden Town, was photographed in a cafe called Fluke's Cradle, and that formed the cover of the album World Gone Wrong. We have a slide for that, Simon, if you're able to put that up. I can't remember what it will be called. I think it'll just say Camden. And in this particular photograph, if we're able to see it, there it is. So that's the cover of World Gone Wrong. Beautiful cover, definitely one of my favorites. But Dylan is sitting there in front of a rather tortured painting by an Irish artist called Peter Gallagher. And the first that Peter Gallagher knew about this was when friends of his were spotting posters for the album up, on bus stops or wherever, and phoned him up to say, "Oh, we've just seen your painting on the back of a Bob Dylan album, on the cover of a Bob Dylan album." But nobody had asked Peter Gallagher's permission to reproduce his painting, and it all became very complicated. Some woman had contacted him a little bit earlier, clearly knowing what was going on, and offered to buy it from him, I don't know, £500 or something. And in the end, Bob Dylan himself bought it, because they had to get the rights to be able to use it on the album. And then in the end, I think Dylan gave it back to Peter Gallagher, and they put a credit to him on the album itself. But I think I hope everybody would agree that is a pretty magnificent album cover there. And he was also videoed as he walked through Camden Town on that day in July, 21st of July, by a female photographer whose name I can't quite remember, Anna Velez Wood, I think. And she took the video, and that film was used on one of the tracks on World Gone Wrong is called Blood in My Eyes. Fantastic track. If you've not heard it, if you're not familiar with that album, and many people won't be, then Blood on My Eyes is a standout track, as is the title track, World Gone Wrong, and frankly, all of the tracks on that album. And you can see the video for it, which is really a lovely one of Dylan just walking through Camden Town. Anyone who's ever been to Camden will know that there's a place called Dingwalls, and there's the Camden Lock, and there's a bridge that goes over the Camden Lock, and he walks across that. So yes, Michael, it's a lovely story. And on the earlier picture that Simon put up for us, there was Eddie Marsan in the Crouch End, but Keith and I were sitting in a cafe in Crouch End called Banners Cafe, and Dylan had gone to Banners to sit there with somebody. I think they had insisted that he had to buy some food. And afterwards they put up a plaque, a lovely bronze plaque saying Bob Dylan sat here. And if you're ever that way, you can pop into Banners. Possibly, if you want to sit at that table, as obviously we did, it is best to book in advance. You can, on their website, they have a whole page for the Bob Dylan table, and the food is fantastic in Banners Cafe up there in North London.
There are only a couple of questions, Jackie, but before we take them, I want you to talk a little bit about the room in the Troubadour. Tell us about the Troubadour itself and your role in the Dylan room.
Sure. So we have a slide here of the Dylan room at the Troubadour. So the Troubadour, as we've mentioned earlier, and you'll see it on that slide on the left, there's that photograph that we put up earlier of Dylan and his friends playing there in January 1963. He was there at least 3 times, possibly more, in that first trip. It's where he learned, was learning songs. So the Troubadour is hugely important in Dylan's story. But when Keith and I first popped in, there were pictures of all sorts of people on the walls. There were huge pictures of the Beatles, who'd never played at the Troubadour. There was a whole room devoted to Ernest Shackleton. Sorry, I'd never know my poles. Is it Arctic or polar? It's all the same thing. Anyway, he's one of those polar explorers. A whole room. There was tennis rackets on the wall, all sorts of really odd things there, but no pictures of Bob Dylan. So we asked, this is Keith, he'll always just say, oh, let's just ask. I'll think, oh, surely, they won't say yes. Who are we? We're not interior designers. What do we know? But I've learned a lot from Keith, which is if you don't ask, you don't get. So we popped along one day. We said, could we put up a picture? And they said, have a room. So we got an entire room, and we literally kitted it out entirely ourselves with posters that we'd got from market stalls. You'll see the second picture on the left, there's a very vibrant, it glows in the dark, a fluorescent pink poster that I bought on Greenwich Market. Keith got the big blue one with Dylan from a UK concert tour. The Dylan Room sign in the blue was handmade, and the big timeline that you see across the middle there was designed by Rob Penny, who's a designer, and he's the partner of Julia, who's illustrated the book for us. The bad news, no, not bad news. The worrying news is, just backtracking. When we first went there, you set foot in the Troubadour, you go through this heavy, gorgeous, big door, and you're stepping into the 1950s. It's just how it was. It's a coffee shop opened in the 50s, grimy, full of character, absolutely fantastic place. And the stage is downstairs. The stage is in the basement where Dylan would have been. So all the more reason, really, to commemorate Dylan's presence there. But through lockdown, the Troubadour, at first we were really worried that it would just not survive. And then we were worried because they got quite a lot of money from somewhere, and they've decided to use it to refurbish the place. And I think refurbishment is sometimes a word to be, a little bit worried about, because we have no idea. We do know, we've seen some pictures already, and the ceiling, which was a lovely sort of tea colour with years and years of stains, is now white. All of the pots and pans that were hanging from the ceiling, the coffee pots, there's now just a few. So yeah, we've been told that the Dylan Room will stay, but whereas, not that long ago, even a few months ago, we were always say, go to the Troubadour, it's a living museum, it'll be fantastic. We're now having to say to anyone who is thinking of going, and I've had contact with the Cambridge Bob Dylan Society, who contacted me to say that they're planning a trip. We have to say, it might be a bit of a different experience, but fingers crossed that the Dylan Room itself will stay, and that the basement stage will also remain with its wonderful character.
Is Dylan aware of the room?
Oh, wouldn't that be nice? Yes, we could ask him to do a nice metal gate for it or something, for us, or a painting. Yeah, well, could you donate one of your paintings? Actually, do you know what?
Gates like the Nottingham Castle gate.
Yes, yes. Do you know what? We should ask, because last night at the Wanstead Tap, this guy came up to us and he said that he had invited Bob Dylan to his wedding. I was like, what did you do that for? And he didn't, obviously Bob Dylan didn't turn up to his wedding, but the Bob Dylan's office did send him was it tickets to one of his shows? Or anyway, if you don't ask, you don't get. So perhaps we should see if there's anything they would like to donate to the Dylan Room. We had so many plans for it, Michael. You know, it's such a fantastic space. We wanted to just perhaps put a wall where artists, local artists, could do their own thing, Dylan related artwork. We could have miniature little exhibitions there. We are very, very close with the Dylan Band, a really fantastic covers band. They don't imitate Dylan, but they do play his music really brilliantly. We got them a residency at the Troubadour, and they've played quite a few gigs there. So to be able to turn it into a place where not only could you just come and sit and potentially bump into other people who share your passion for Bob Dylan, you could hear music and just see a small exhibition perhaps. But yeah, we don't really know what the future holds for the Dylan Room.
We'll keep our fingers crossed.
Please do, please do.
What little time remains, let's have a look at these questions. Now they both refer to earlier parts, no problem about that. Do you think Dylan, this is from Alan Jepson, do you think Dylan was deliberately playing to the camera when he accused that bloke of throwing a glass out of his hotel room window in Don't Look Back?
No, I don't. I mean, for anyone who hasn't seen it, Dylan gets extremely angry. I think it really shows his kind of very middle-class upbringing in a way, because it turns out it was a beautiful Art Deco shelf in one of the bathrooms, and for some reason, I guess someone was a little bit, had too much to drink. They threw it out the window, and one of the hotel staff, came and basically said this had happened, and Dylan was absolutely furious. Now, I know I said earlier that Dylan would have always been aware of the camera, but I think he genuinely was really horrified that somebody would have done this.
It's entirely authentic to me.
Yeah, exactly. Entirely. Not to say that he wasn't aware that he was being filmed. And it does look a bit like when you see it afterwards, you think, come on, like, okay, it wasn't a good thing to do. But no, Alan, I don't think he was playing to the camera as such. I think that he genuinely meant every word that he said. Now,
the other question, would be interesting to see if you can answer this one, from Michael Stock. On the cover art of that album by Von Schmidt's Farina Grunt that we talked about, there is supposedly a hidden dirty word, which I can't find. Is that true?
I can't answer it. Sorry, I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. That would be one to ask some of our Dylan contacts. I can get Keith to put that on his Dylan in London Twitter feed and see if anybody knows that, because I mean, this is one of the things with Bob Dylan. I know a fair bit about Bob Dylan and London. I learn every day. Everywhere I go, somebody tells me something. I was wearing my Bob Dylan in London sweatshirt in B&Q recently, and some guy came up to me and was telling me about gigs he had seen of Dylan in Birmingham. It is just so fantastic to hear what other people have to teach. And you'll never ever stop learning with Bob Dylan. You're never going to know all the answers. I wouldn't even hope to be honest.
Well, Dylan in Nottingham would be a slim volume, but here's another famous photo of Dylan.
Isn't it great? Isn't it a great photo? Such an unmissable photo opportunity there.
I just don't think he realised that it was a book use, but nevertheless. Anyway, it's 8 o'clock, and if anybody's got a last question, please get it in really quickly, because otherwise I'll have to thank Keith in his absence and Jackie for continued presence. It really is a lovely, very useful book as well. And I hope you all buy it and enjoy it. And
come to London. Come to London. There's a map in the book which is deliberately hoped to entice you down. Bring your placard, go to the Savoy Steps, take yourself a picture with a Subterranean Homesick Blues placard, go into the American bar at the Savoy Hotel, pop into the Mayfair Hotel, we didn't really talk about it, go to the Troubadour, King and Queen, all these places, up to Banners. You can follow Dylan's trail just as we did.
So you can, or you can still get in that Savoy Chapel, can you? It sounds as if
You can go in the Savoy Chapel, but you can also go into the Savoy Hotel, into the American Bar, and I mean, you can go and get a room there if you've got money to burn, obviously. But yeah, almost some of Earls Court Stadium is long gone, so not everything is still there. But plenty of places are, and our map in the middle of the book is intended to sort of show you at least the relative positions of all these locations, and just relive some of those wonderful times, and listen to the music that goes with them. There's kind of a playlist in a way that goes through Dylan's time. There is a playlist actually on Spotify which I could share with anybody that wanted it. But anyway, yes, but it's been fantastic. I wish, of course, that we could have spoken personally with people and heard your own experiences, particularly your Nottingham experiences of Dylan. But yeah, it's been wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for your questions.
The last time he played Nottingham was marvelous. It was just.
Wow. And what year was that, Michael?
Well, I've got the tickets up here, so I think it was April 27th. I'm rotten on years. I think it was April 2017.
Wow, quite recently.
Yeah, it was. I saw him in Hyde Park. We never mentioned Hyde Park. His last
Sure.
visit a couple of years ago. But
Sure.
anyway, if anybody was at the Nottingham concert the night that I was, you'll remember it as one of the standout nights of your life. Well, anyway, sorry, we got a bit over time, so I'll say farewell, Jackie. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Michael. Lovely questions, and it was a real pleasure. And goodbye to everybody that's listening that I can't actually see, which is quite disconcerting. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye bye.